Welcome to another edition of the In Memoriam edition of the podcast. Today we are here to talk about David Pingree, a monumental figure in the history of astrology. And we have today with us Professor Charles Burnett, Professor Alexander Jones, Professor I should say professors because everyone here is one. Stephan Heilen and Professor Kim Plofker. Thank you very much for joining us and share with us your experience with the late David Pingree as colleagues, as students,
as friends
also. I would give you the word to you who knew Professor Pingree.
I would ask, how did you, what is your first recollection of Professor Pingree? How did you met? How did you met?
You want in chronological or reverse chronological order?
Mm-hmm.
So would that be, with Charles, would that be you?
Am I the oldest one here? Maybe I am. Yes.
Or at least with the longest acquaintance with him.
Well, the longest acquaintance, yes. Well, I first met David Pingree in the Duke Humphrey Library of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which is, of course, where all the manuscripts are. And we were immediately looking at manuscripts together, talking about one work which has always been at the back of my mind, the Book of the Nine Judges, which is a book, a translation, a book put together by Herman of Carinthia and Hugo Santelliensis from 9 different Arabic sources about astrological interrogations and judgments. A very long book. And the first thing that David said was, "You're going to edit it, aren't you?" And I still haven't edited it, but he just took it for granted that people could edit texts, whether they were in Latin or Greek or Arabic or Persian or Akkadian, just at a drop of a hat, very, very quickly. And really, I mean, what attracted me to him was the importance that he attached to the edited text, a good edition of a work, whether it was of astronomy, astrology, magic, and so, I mean, after a couple of years, I was actually working with him in Brown University, in the famous Wilbur Hall, where we had this coterie of very fine historians of exact mathematics. And he was just so patient. We would take a text, in fact, it was the Liber Aristotelis of Hugo Santelliensis, and he would spend 2 or 3 hours just sitting next to me, reading the text with me, and making all kinds of very pertinent and important comments on the text, until we disbanded or went to lunch, which in America is at an enormously early time of about 11:30, and joined Otto Neugebauer, who was still around in Wilbur Hall, and Gerard Toomer, and the dogs. I mean, David always had his dog Junior with him, a rather, one might say, intellectually challenged dog. Who was a kind of antidote to David's super intelligence. And Gerard Toomer had his 2 corgis. I don't think Otto Neugebauer had any dogs. Anyway, we all had lunch and then we went back to the text. But I was just so grateful and happy that we could just read a text word by word, make sure that we understood it. He was writing the commentary. I was making sure that the Latin made sense and so on. And this attention to the accuracy of texts. I mean, he used to use all the manuscripts of any text that he was editing, and not only was it an attention to the accuracy of the text, but it was also an attention to the vocabulary, the glossary, and so on. And I remember when he came to the Warburg Institute, where I have been since 1979, in fact, he spent a whole summer just drawing up a glossary to his 2-volume work of Vettius Valens. And I was just amazed that he should spend so much time in fact, what happened was that it was published by Teubner, and all the page numbers, all the line numbers were changed. So he spent the whole summer just writing a glossary, changing all the page numbers and all the line numbers. He had such patience, and he was not averse to doing the most menial of academic jobs rather than sharing them with poor research students or younger colleagues, and his humility, as it were, in doing everything, both the difficult job of actually establishing a text, and also the rather tedious job of writing glossaries to that text, because he thought they were very important. Really impressed me and gave me a model to follow.
Well, if we're following in chronological order, I'd probably come next. So, I was a student in the history of math department at Brown from 1981 to 1985. So I suppose I must first have met David when I went for a visit to the department the year before to see whether this is where I wanted to go, and for them to see whether they wanted to take me. I don't really remember that, but I do remember sort of the experience of particularly my first year of taking classes with David. I was studying with David and with Gerald Toomer. This was at the time when there still were the 4 members of the department all active in the department. Abe Sachs was still alive, and Neugebauer was still at Brown, but both of them, of course, were retired, but still very much a presence. And yes, I do remember the dogs, which the downstairs dogs, Gerald Corgis, were. They came off as quite lively and aggressive, and David's was very soporific on the whole. But the classes David did with me, and they were always one-on-one. I mean, the total student body at that time was 2 students. And the other student was always someone who was primarily studying Sanskrit. And I wasn't doing Sanskrit, so I would be doing classes in texts in Greek, and they tended to be classes that were connected with something that David was working on, making an edition of, or studying it in some intense way. So my first semester, I think he did a class on translations of medieval Arabic astronomical texts from around 1300. And then the second semester, we moved into looking at astrological material, primarily Vettius Valens. He was working on his edition at that point. I think it ended up coming out about a year after I finished as a student. And the classes were, they were extremely illuminating, but at the same time a bit difficult for me to take everything in, because we would be working through the text as Charles was describing, really going sort of line by line through it. But he would also have this, he would have this pile of books on the table, which were his running commentary on everything. And sort of gradually through the course of a 2-hour meeting, he would pick up the top item on this and open it up somewhere where there'd be something that would be relevant to understanding this passage. And then he would shut it and put it in a different pile, and the next book would be in line. And there was really not very much opportunity for me, since I knew nothing about these texts beyond what he was saying, to really contribute anything except just absorbing it all. It was quite an experience being in those classes. But they were also, he had a very, he was a very gentle man, but had a wonderful sense of humor, not in a jokey way at all, but just, I think he thought of history as being something that you had to see the comical side of sometimes in order to really appreciate all the other parts of it. And things that were not really essential for understanding the text, but just were sort of side stories about the histories of manuscripts and the people who had brought them from Byzantium to Italy and so on. These things would sort of leaven the more detailed philological and technical side of the classes.
Yes. So very intense classes.
Oh, they were very, yes. I mean, basically, I would come away having really absorbed perhaps about 10% of what he had been talking about, and then I'd have to go back and read everything, which I think was the point.
I was in the, as like Alex, in the Brown History of Mathematics program from 1989 to 1995. And then I was there off and on as a postdoc afterwards until about 2004. So yeah, a lot of varied experience. And my first visit, my first meeting with Professor Pingree was the visit for, as like Alex, had that experience of when you're considering graduate programs, is this the place for you? And yes, just the amazing the suite of rooms on the first floor of Wilbur Hall, with books stacked not only on all the bookshelves, but just in piles everywhere. At that time, it was only Gerald Toomer, besides Professor Pingree, who was there, I think half-time perhaps, but for that first year I was there, Jamil Rajab, who has been at McGill subsequently in the Center for Islamic Science, was a postdoc with a one-year appointment, and working with Professor Pingree on the aspects of the Ptolemaic tradition and Greco-Islamic astronomy. And, so I met him, and I was enjoyed talking to him and thinking, well, since, I'll be working on Sanskrit and he studies Arabic, I guess we won't have much communication, but it's nice to have good people around. So, I get an acceptance letter from them. I send my acceptance back. I'm looking forward to this. I get a letter from Jamil Rajab about the June 1989 saying, so glad that you are coming to Brown. Professor Pingree and I have discussed it, and we think you should begin studying Arabic this summer. So, you buy this book. I'm willing to, once you can read the alphabet, I'll be willing to meet with you once a week. And I'm thinking, Arabic? I didn't say I wanted to study Arabic, but
I got that too, I'm afraid.
But of course, fortunately, I was just smart enough to know how dumb I was and not, make any objections. And that is simply a classic example of the attitude of the whole department, and especially Professor Pingree, as Charles was saying. You just didn't, it was taken for granted that you would study the things that were connected, that you would have these transmissions between different linguistic and cultural traditions, and you wouldn't just carve out turf for yourself and barricade yourself behind linguistic barriers. You would, if you didn't know the languages or the technical details required to study a subject, by golly, you would learn them.
Yes. Yeah.
One lovely experience of that first year, I remember, was Svi Langerman was visiting, working on some of the Hebrew texts. And he had a Hebrew manuscript of the planetary hypotheses of Ptolemy. And Jamil had an Arabic version of it, and Professor Pingree had the Greek. So there was, I was able to sit in on and take notes for this seminar that they had, just working through these three different versions of this rather dense text and talking about it. And as Alex said, it was so much that was just way beyond me and over my head at that point, but it was just so absolutely exciting. I remember Tzvi came in with a note in his manuscript on one point, to anybody who reads this translation, I just want to say that I'm sorry I translated it. And just we all cracked up at that. And it was the most wonderful introduction to how the excitement, as Charles was saying, of just working with original texts, focusing on editing the text, not restricting yourself to just the corpus of already published works. That was anathema to him. It was, you had to be able to get out there and read the surviving materials and not just rely on what people had pre-digested for you.
Well, we couldn't agree more.
May I just say, didn't David require of every PhD student that he or she already knew 2 ancient languages, whether it was Sanskrit and Arabic, or Sanskrit and Greek, or Latin and Arabic, which was, it's quite a tough ask, a big ask, really.
I came in, and because I was not a classicist to start with, but I came in with some Sanskrit, continued with that, with Arabic, did some Latin and some Greek as well, and we even worked on a bit of Persian, which was, I think, Professor Pingree's, the first time he really got into learning Persian. So that was an education in itself, just to see how somebody so experienced and learned in classical languages set out to learn a new one. Of course, we, started right with a manuscript, appalling nostalgic script that was just like lines of
nostalgic. Yes.
Not figured that out. But yeah, absolutely. About the transmission was a very big part of the subject.
Mm-hmm. So I think, Stephan, please.
Yes. Well, my acquaintance with David Pingree began very late in the summer of 2005, at least my personal acquaintance with him. I had read many of his books and articles by that time, because both my doctoral dissertation and my German Habilitation, which I was about to finish in that summer of 2005, were about topics in the history of astrology. So Professor David Pingree was a towering authority, of course, for me, but I never had an opportunity to meet him in person until that summer, when my doctoral advisor, Wolfgang Hübner, was about to retire. And I knew that various people were expecting that I should take care of a Festschrift. And I was well aware of the enormous amount of work that usually goes into such a job. So I was very happy when a senior professor in the Münster department suggested that I rather organize a small conference instead of editing a Festschrift. And that turned out to be very interesting, because luckily authorities such as Charles Burnett and Hermann Hunger and Paul Kunitsch were willing to come to Münster in order to honor Wolfgang Hübner on that occasion. So we had, with these scholars and a group of doctoral students, a small but very nice conference on the history of astrology. And David Pingree was also among the speakers. That was my first opportunity to meet him in person. And since I was about to submit my, by the way, in the course of that, of those days in Münster, there was one delightful situation. I must tell this little anecdote briefly. We have a rather important astronomical clock in the Cathedral of Münster, and we had organized a guided tour to that astronomical clock. But while most of the people were standing in front of the clock and listening to the explanations, I realized that a small group of people, namely David Pingree, Charles Burnett, and Hermann Hunger, Charles, correct me if I remember wrongly, but they understandably had withdrawn a bit and were sitting in one of the remotest benches in the dark part of the church, enjoying the opportunity of chatting with each other after a long time that they had not seen each other, which in retrospect, if I think of the fact that this was in August 2005, less than 100 days before he died, that was certainly an important situation for these friends to gather, probably the last time on that occasion. And for me, that those days were very important because I was about to be unemployed from January onwards. So I was trying to get a fellowship for the United States in order to work somehow with David Pingree and to learn from him. I had this preparation in Greek and Latin astrological texts. And since he was in poor health, of course, at that time, and had these very severe eye problems also, he was willing to consider such a cooperation with me in Providence, and he eagerly supported the attempts to obtain permission from his chair in the department and such things. And from those, so we exchanged several letters in August 2005. This is one of them, and you. Oh, one moment, and you see the logo of Brown University, and I pulled up this letter because in this letter he explained to me which topics he would like to work on with me once I would arrive in Providence. I did not this entire plan did not work out because of his premature death, but it was it is probably of interest to read quickly the few lines which projects he wanted to work on at that point. So the decisive lines say, the texts that I have in mind for us to work on are ones I've been working on for a number of years in the second volume of Epitomes of Rhetorius, almost finished. An edition of the Greek and Latin versions of Chardin's Mudakarat Abu Mashar. Sorry, Charles, I cannot pronounce that correctly. Mutakarat bi Abi Mashar, largely finished, but I shall have much to do with the Arabic. Related to this, the Cantiloquium Hermetis. I've collated some 60 or so manuscripts. Imagine all the effort that went into those collations. So he collated some 60 or so manuscripts, and Pseudo-Plato's Liber Vaccae, about half of the manuscripts have been collated. Besides these, I have some Byzantine and Latin translations of works of Masha Allah, of what I have made tentative Arabic texts. After all these, more needs to be done on the tradition of the Picatrix in Renaissance Europe. And 5 days later, he added one item saying, to the long list I sent you of possible projects, I should add one more, an edition of the astrological works of Theophilus of Edessa. We can discuss what exactly to do later. So I was immensely motivated and eager to travel to Providence and work, probably not on all of them, but at least on some of this material with him for 1 or 2 years. That, of course, was then not really possible, but since I got an assistant professorship in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, I stopped over on that was in the following year, and I hope I'm not spending too much time explaining this, but it may be of interest for the following conversation here. I stopped over in May 2006 in Providence in order to examine his many papers and manuscripts in Wilbur Hall, with, of course, with Isabel's, his widow's permission and support. I also stayed at their home. Isabel was immensely kind and allowed me to stay at their home. So we had very interesting conversations about his education, the way he became such a important scholar, and during the day I would try not to be overcome by desperation, seeing those piles of thousands and thousands of photocopies and half-finished manuscripts and articles, and everything was still as if he would return a few minutes later, because he had been taken to a hospital, not expecting. He was expecting to return a few days later from the hospital. And fortunately, I was able to find the scattered parts of his edition of, at least of the first volume, of his edition of Rhetorius, which was probably among his many Greek editions the project that was dearest to his heart. At least he had been working on that since the mid-70s, so for about 30 years. And the first volume was ready for publication, but there were no computer files at that time. At least there were some, but not of the latest date among his doctoral students, but he would not work and type things in a computer. So the thing to find was his personal manual, his typescript, the printed version on which he used to work. That was the only complete version. And with much help by Isabel, we were able to find the various parts in Wilbur Hall at their home. And I know I should have brought this to publication much earlier, but I was prevented by various circumstances. This will or shall follow as soon as possible now, but that was very impressive to see Wilbur Hall, the environment in which he had been working so intensely. And one last detail which I should like to add: when I arrived in Urbana-Champaign, my senior colleague and personal friend, William Calder, who happens to be arguably the leading historian of classical scholarship in the 20th century, he was very eager to write an obituary of his former classmate, David Pingree, because they had been in the same class at Harvard College. And so there were many phone calls and letters being exchanged between Isabel Pingree and the two of us, which provided us with very interesting information regarding his education. To mention just one or two details which I found very noteworthy. He went to that excellent boarding school, Phillips Academy, Andover, Massachusetts, which, as I found out only today, they have a Latin motto which says, finis origine pendet. When I read this, I felt reminded of Manilius, Book 4, line 16, probably the most famous line in Manilius, that the end depends on the beginning, on the birth chart. And it is actually taken from Manilius, but of course, Philip's Academy intended it in the sense that education determines the outcome of a young person's life. So in a way he had, even if this is probably only a coincidence, but there was Manilius already present in that education at Philip's Academy, Andover. And the question that I thought about today before starting our interview was especially what brought David Pingree to astrology. And to my knowledge, please, I ask the other experts to correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to have been his experience when he was 22 years old on a Fulbright fellowship in Rome at the Vatican Library, examining Greek manuscripts for paleographical purposes. So imagine he was 22 years old, a very young man, far away from home in Italy, examining these manuscripts. And he noticed in the manuscript 1056, one of the most important manuscripts regarding Greek astrological texts, that there were Indian elements written on the margins of various leaves, and that sparked for him the insight, because the manuscript was obviously translated from Arabic, so he understood that this must have come from the Arabic world and then still further back from India. And I think that that was the beginning of his really enormous project of investigating these various cultures in order to understand the transmissions and transformations of astrology better.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, it's difficult to ask something at this point, but this would be probably the way he entered astrology, and then he studied mainly the transmission from one culture to the other, would you say?
Yeah, he then got fellowships at, Kim, were you going to respond?
It doesn't matter. I was, I think you've got the chronological sequence there. So yeah, talk about the fellowships there.
Okay, I try to be brief. He understood that he would have to learn Arabic, which he didn't know at the time when he was in Italy. So he started learning that after his return to America. He also spent 1 or 2 years in India in order to familiarize himself from 1958 to 1960 in order to study the Sanskrit tradition of astrological texts. And it was his contact with the Yavana Jataka of Spujitvaja, which allowed him to understand that there were apparently Babylonian planetary models used somehow in the text. At least this is what he asserted in a small autobiography, which he composed a bit before his death. And so he writes in that little autobiography, which William Calder and I published in 2007, that for this reason, he got into contact with Otto Neugebauer after his return to America, because he was the expert on Babylonian mathematical astronomy. And if I may add one last detail, I think, Alex, you may know that, you probably know that better, but I think in a way, David Pingree imitated that polyglot approach of Otto Neugebauer. My impression is Neugebauer, he studied ancient Egyptian and cuneiform texts in order to be able to examine these mathematical documents seriously. And he already had this, if I may call that, polyglot approach to the history of science, of ancient science. And in a way, my impression is that David Pingree did a very similar thing in the field of history of astrology, similarly learning Arabic. Well, he already knew Sanskrit and Greek from his college education, but he had to add Arabic and also to some extent cuneiform texts in order to master the complex net of transmissions and transformations of these doctrines.
He always said, yes, that Otto Neugebauer was a very formative influence, especially in his early career. I mean, he thought of Neugebauer as really an equivalent to the graduate advisor, who is Daniel Ingalls in the Sanskrit and Indic studies at Harvard. And yeah, I think it was Neugebauer who, or at least Professor Pingree always described it as Neugebauer having sent him to Chicago, to the Oriental Institute, to study Akkadian, cuneiform texts. And yes, just to get this whole conspectus on the development of pan-Eurasian exact sciences, to use a term that is potentially controversial here.
If I can just say, well, the fact that he always insisted that astrology was an exact science. It belonged to the exact mathematical science. I mean, because they were so closely connected with astronomy. But what Kim has just referred to, the pan-Euro-Asian canvas, as it were, is really very important. That he, well, not only was he looking at texts which originated in Babylonia, in Mesopotamia, or in Egypt, and passed into Greece, and then passed into India, and then came back from India, and so on. But even further east, into Chinese, into Persian, into Chinese, into Japanese. And this is indicated, amongst other things, by the fact that he had a very great influence on Japanese scholars. One mustn't forget people like Michio Yano, a Sanskritist, who was working in Brown with him for a couple of years, and who developed an interest in Sanskrit astrology and how it penetrated not only into Chinese Buddhist culture, but also eventually into Japanese through the Chinese. And of course, he had PhD students from Japan, Tsukuba being the main one, another Sanskritist. But his universal, his global influence, as it were, is really very conspicuous.
He was always a little apologetic about the fact that he himself could not read Chinese. But, he was always very, took ownership of that. He was never one of the scholars who tried to create artificial barriers to different areas, or to pretend that the areas that they don't know about are somehow less relevant or less important. It was all, it's all connected. It's all important. Humanly speaking, we can't, any of us, do all of it, though he probably came as any 5 normal human beings could.
Well,
but but that was all, that didn't in any way devalue or undervalue the importance of that material itself.
Well, just a little note on that. We, myself and a colleague, set up a project at the Warburg Institute on Islam and Tibet to look at the relationship between those two cultures. And I wrote to David Pingree, and he said, well, I have done a bit of Tibetan. Yes.
from what I take from all the testimonies is that he was a person that did not see barriers between cultures. He saw bridges and roads and communication, and not only the languages, but the techniques, all the ideas, the science. So it was quite, I wouldn't say universal, but quite global, perhaps the word, like a very encompassing perspective of knowledge and astrology in special, but knowledge in general and languages. I think that is one of the amazing parts. When people see a book, when people read one of the books, I think we don't really understand how much work is in a book. You see, because it's the final product, a book, and how many years, how many studies, how many languages, how many contacts, how many documents were read. And this, our conversation, I think it's making this clear, all the work.
And I wonder can I share my screen? I have a photograph of Pingree. Kim, were you at Brown at the time when Wilbur Hall was being renovated and his library was moved into the old gym?
The basketball court in the old Pembroke
right
gym. Oh, absolutely.
And there's this spectacular, if I can find this.
Yes, that was quite. I mean, there was this massive basketball court that he had all his books and manuscripts set up in, and it was, this vast barn of a place with an incredibly noisy heating system that didn't work very well. But he thought it was just ideal because he had all these low, bookcases. He could just walk along these aisles. Yes, just like that.
It's a beautiful photograph too. I mean, the photographer who I think retired from Brown University not long after did two magnificent photographs that encapsulate the spirit of the History of Math department. There's this one. This was after, this was after my time at Brown. But there's the other one of Neugebauer, showing him bent over his studies, and again, it's just a masterpiece of encapsulating the scholarly spirit. And just, this is not typical because this was at a time when he had his library deployed in such a neat way. There are not the piles of papers all over the floor. So this is not really what it was like to be in his office with him for a class under normal conditions, but it still, I think, catches him.
Yeah, he finally had room to spread out. He had really half an entire basketball court full of those like head height shelves, and he could, walk along in the same room with the lights installed over the shelves you see there and see everything. But you do see those piles of paper on that table. So
yeah, but not on the floor.
Whatever happened to that table? That was the Wilbur 101, was it? The class table.
That's the table with the piles of books that I have classes on. Yep. I don't know who has it now. Okay, so.
But you can also see how, he suffered from very bad eyesight.
Oh, yes,
and so he had to put his face very close to his books.
Yes, I remember we invited him to a little conference on ancient science at University of Toronto when I was in the classics department there, and he brought his paper, of course, entirely handwritten in that very neat handwriting he had, and he was holding it up like this through the whole thing. So in fact, his talk was inaudible to anyone who wasn't in the front row, I'm sorry to say. But yes, I can't imagine if he was alive today, how he would deal with the modern publishing world, because, with the whole business of having to do everything through these horrible electronic submission systems, he could never do this.
I was the kind of liaison for when he first started that. When I began in 1989, my proctorship, as it was called, my research assistantship, involved typesetting the most recent volume of his Census of the Exact Sciences in Sanskrit. So that was volume 5, I think, which had been, a project that had been stalled after volume 4 for something like 10 or 15 years because the publishers were requiring camera-ready copy. And of course, as you said, he didn't produce that. But with a good system, he was not a technophile, you might say, but he did appreciate the advantages of some of the things you could do with modern information technology, as long as he had an amanuensis of the actual interface with the computer.
Yeah, in the same way, in the somewhat slightly more primitive days of computing, he had me write Fortran program to calculate star positions for for working with Christopher Walker on the one of these early-ish Babylonian star texts.
Yeah, I think with the image that is coming out of David Pingree, this beyond his human side and his kindness and his attention to people, is also the mark he left on the academia, on his disciples, on the people who worked with him, who knew him, who were his colleagues, and also in how shall I say, creating an impulse for what is being still done today on the knowledge, the transmission of knowledge, the addition of texts, and it is something that I wasn't aware of, yes. Which is
especially the idea of no barriers, because I like this idea very much.
Yes,
of all the transmission and kind of this free area where knowledge just transmits.
Yeah. And it's because of course we knew and we know that of the magnitude of his work and the importance and the impact of the work, but I think now what we're seeing
this is different,
a much more different picture, and how larger is his impact as a scholar in the way that there's a continuation of this wave till this day.
So we thank you all for being with us. If you have more, please, we can stay. We can stay here. If you have more, or we can finish now, and you can reschedule another conversation. It was a pleasure to talk to each one of you. Thank you very much.
And we thank you have giving your time to give your testimony for the podcast.
And it's especially amazing because we are all in different time zones. So thank you very much for everyone. It's night for some and morning for others. So it's really, thank you very much for all coming together to talk about this amazing scholar and human being. So thank you.
I think I'm speaking for us all in saying it's a real pleasure to do this and to reminisce about
yes.
someone I think for all of us was an extremely important formative figure.